On behalf of the staff and board of directors of Housing California, I wish to thank you for joining us for our Housing California 2020 Virtual End Conference. I am both humbled and honored to share this experience with almost 1,000 partners, friends, and allies working to create homes, health, and prosperity for all in the Golden State. 2020 marks the first year we are gathering virtually. So I have a couple of recommendations to deepen your conference experience and create space in your week and in your life for real change. I ask that you take this moment to do the following 3 steps to send you on a path for a powerful conference experience. First, pause. Take a deep breath in and a complete breath out. 2020 has been, well, overwhelming, and to overcome it, we start by breathing deeply. Then take a moment to reflect on where we have been. Let's look especially at health and racial justice and determine what we have learned from it that we can integrate into our work. We are at a historical inflection point, and to weave its lessons into the tapestry of our neighborhoods, we must consider them carefully and act with intention. We must own the past in order to transform the future. Second, connect. Engage with someone you've never met or someone you know but have never worked with. You can do this in the exhibit hall, a session chat window, or during one of the networking events. Meet colleagues across sectors. You may learn from a key insight or take away a key message. Practice patience, ask for grace, and use empathy as your tool. Last, dream and dream big. On this point, I'm inspired by the remarks of the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, at last year's climate change conference. He said, quote, "We see some incremental steps, but nowhere near the scope and scale required. What we need is not an incremental approach, but a transformational one," end quote. Here in California, we can no longer continue with the same old small ball piecemeal approach, working with the resources that do not fit the scale of the need. What transformational ideas can we deliver when we end this week? How can we find the policies and the investments needed to implement them? When we find those missing puzzle pieces, they will fit together to form a roadmap home, a comprehensive coordinated plan to end homelessness and build stable, affordable homes for all. You can learn more about this initiative at roadmaphomeca.org. We hope you'll post on social media using the hashtag HousingCA2020. If you have any questions or need a helping hand, please review the user experience guide or drop us a line at info@housingca.org. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's dive in, dream big, and transform together.
Good morning. I hope you all can hear me. Welcome to Housing California's 2020 Unconference. Apologies, we know there were some glitches with interpretation. My hope is that that is all sorted out now, but if you're still having challenges, just bear with us for a second. Thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you all. We had hoped to be in person for this annual tradition and are just thrilled that people made it to come and join us today virtually. My name is Shioni Flegel. I'm the chair of the Housing California Board. I work for PolicyLink. PolicyLink is a national equity organization working to ensure that all people in our country, particularly those who face the burdens of structural racism, participate in a just society, live in a healthy community of opportunity, and prosper in an equitable economy. We focus on advancing liberating policies for the 100 million people living in or near poverty, the majority of whom are people of color. For us to do our work well, we know that housing is critical, that it is a cornerstone for folks having opportunity and being able to thrive. For that reason, we are so excited to be meeting with a wonderful group of folks today. Before we dive into our first panel, I want to invite our friend and colleague, Elizabeth, to join us. Elizabeth Elliott is joining us from the Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority. She is going to take us through a land acknowledgement and help ground us in this moment, create space for us to come together and to launch this week's journey that we'll be starting together. Elizabeth, if I can pass it to you.
On behalf of the staff and board,
Machixismilia. Welcome to the Housing California Unconference. My name is Elizabeth Elliott, and I'm the Executive Director of Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority in Ukiah, California. The land on which we reside on is the occupied territory of Yamobita. I was asked to take you on a journey to talk about stolen lands and stolen people. For us to start talking about housing justice, we must first acknowledge whose homes were stolen to provide you with the land you reside on. In order to bring justice forward, we must acknowledge the genocide and displacement of the first people of California. And how do we do that in a structure that was made to make us the enemy? How can we talk about change when we have never admitted that this state was built upon the enslavement of Black and brown bodies? The journey of California into statehood is rooted in patriarchy and intentional harm through legislative policy. Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, was a former slaveholder from Tennessee who came to this land with the dream of a statehood where people of color did not or would not exist. He believed that Black and brown bodies were inferior, savage, unworthy, and should not be allowed human rights. So much so that he fostered the Indian Act of 1850, which legalized the indentured servitude of Native Americans. This meant that settlers could force the Native people off their land, away from the only home they had ever known, and into indentured slavery. In 1851, Governor Burnett stated in an executive order that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This must be expected. Why does this matter? Why should you as a housing professional care? Because the systemic plan for the extermination of California tribal communities is still evident through structural inequities. For example, Native American people in California were not considered citizens until 1924. Tribal communities have creation stories. We did not migrate here. We are of and from this land. While I was serving as a cultural monitor, I've had the chance to hold archaeological and basketry tools from California's first people that are nearly 20,000 years old. To truly change, we must acknowledge that our current funding structures aren't meant to promote the evolution of our indigenous communities. In 1962, Native Americans were given the right to vote but could not practice their religion freely until 1978. This means that the generations of those who survived the massacres led by John Kelsey, Peter Burnett, and John Sutter had to hide to preserve their culture and traditions. It's very hard to build a home when you're not allowed to be human. On a scientific level, the genocide here has had a direct health impact on the communities whose back the state was built on. Can you imagine someone taking your home, then only giving one room of your house back? Then telling you how to occupy that room, what can go in that room, and making sure that you never really own that room? Then forcing policies into place, ensuring that you can never really have another home of your own. So when you begin to talk about housing justice, your first step in racial reconciliation for me would be to ensure that tribal communities always have a seat at that table. It wasn't until the passing of AB 1010 in October of 2019 that verbiage was changed to include the governing bodies of Indian reservations and rancherias. Until then, we were excluded or not looked at as local public entities or local governments, thus segregating us from state funding opportunities. Those structural biases exist even in the requirements put on tribal entities for environmental reviews and development. The opportunities are still not equal. As we sit in the middle of a global pandemic, we again see the impacts of structural violence and racism impacts us now more than ever. We can no longer deny the pains of the past don't impact our future. You can see that in the health disparities within the Black and Brown communities that we serve and how their epigenetics from historical trauma leaves them vulnerable and again at the risk of extermination. As you go throughout this conference, please be willing to recognize your privilege and that we will not have healing without restorative justice and systemic change. We cannot change the inequities of the past, but we can ensure the equality of the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Your comments are a powerful reminder that each of us is standing on land that has been home to Native people for time immemorial. In this moment, as we see so many suffering around us from a pandemic that has killed already more than 12,000 Californians, while hundreds of fires are ravaging our state, displacing thousands of people from their homes. Low-income renters and workers are struggling to retain their jobs or are facing eviction as the rent comes due. And Black men, women, and children across the country are repeatedly subject to unjust violence. It's hard to feel like we're making progress. Today and over the next week, we hope all of you will join with us to envision what a different future might look like, to think about what it really means to live into the theme that we've claimed for this conference, our homes, our voice, our future, owning the past and transforming the future. That's what we aspire to as we work together. And that's what we hope all of you will be able to take out of this conference over the next week. Our thoughts go out to all those who are suffering right now, but we know that our thoughts are not enough. That's why the work of Housing California and each of you is more important than ever. This week, let's work together to make sure we're on a path towards advancing racial justice, shaping a new narrative for housing and homelessness, shifting and building power with and for those most impacted by the challenges that we're facing, and advancing true structural change and systems reform policy that will create our California with homes and health, prosperity for everyone. This morning, it's my honor to both introduce our amazing leaders and presenters, as well as to serve as a guide as we start to take this short journey together to acknowledge where we've come from and where we hope to go. I'm going to start by introducing two amazing folks who will share a few opening remarks and then join me along with Elizabeth for a rich conversation focused on our history, healing, and our hopes for the future. Please meet Professor John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and Amanda Andere, the Chief Executive Officer of Funders Together to End Homelessness. John, I'm going to pass it to you. And then when you're done, if we can go straight to Amanda.
Thank you. It's good to be here for the Housing California Conference or Unconference. Although it's still strange to me to be talking to so many people when I can't see you. It looks like I'm talking to my computer. But still, it is good to be here. And I celebrate the work and determination that Housing California has shown over the years to try to make California something that's available for all of us. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the big things we should be thinking about, some of the opportunities, and have a PowerPoint. I may not get through it all, but I'll make it available. So obviously we're dealing with strange times. That's an understatement. We have multiple pandemics, structural racism, violence, the pandemic, COVID-19, fires. It's hard to sort of focus, and the impact is disproportionately affecting people who are already disproportionately affected. Indigenous people, African Americans, Latinos. So it's a time that it's hard to sort of stay focused and not be overwhelmed by all the stuff that's happening. But part of this is actually reflecting what was already in place. So housing is a key, and it's one of the areas where we could and should focus. And it's not just housing. Housing is also a way in which we organize opportunity or deny opportunity. So one of the things that we've done at the Institute on Othering and Belonging is to look at how we segregate people based on opportunity, how we hoard resources, how we use space to actually discriminate and subjugate. This is from Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology. And he's citing the German Constitution. And the Constitution says the distribution and utilization of land are controlled by the state in such a way as to prevent abuses and achieve the object of ensuring that every family has a healthy place to dwell corresponding to its needs. Land required to satisfy needs resulting from shortage of housing or to develop agricultural may be expropriated. Obviously, this is a long way from the United States, but what Piketty is actually highlighting is that not just in Germany, but other parts of the world, we're recognizing that land is to serve people. Something just happened and my screen went away. One of the things we're doing in the era of COVID-19 is looking at how do we keep people in their houses. And of course, many people don't have a house to be kept in, but for those who are on the margin, so it's things like canceling rent. And I would say canceling eviction, But also we have to protect small homeowners. So someone 80 units. If they lose their house, then their renters are likely to lose the house. So we have to think about the whole system and not just one part of it. I may need help from the tech people. Okay. So I can no longer advance my slides if you can hear me. Okay, so housing is in some ways the epicenter of opportunity, and it gives us access to many different things. And so we're talking about structures and how do we actually build structures to enhance opportunity. And again, housing is at the center of that. Next slide. And this opportunity is not distributed in an even way. We're the Othering and Belonging Institute, and othering is basically when you deny someone their full humanity, when you deny that someone is of full value. And we do this across all different kinds of sectors, or um, based on someone's ability, their sexual orientation, their gender, their race, their skin tone, their ethnicity, their age, and many others. Next slide. So when we're addressing the problem of othering, that is saying someone is not fully human, it's not fully valued, or to be used just to be exploited. Sometimes we think the answer to othering is saming, and it's not. We're not saying we're all the same. We're not all the same. So the solution for othering is not saming, but belonging. Next slide. Part of the thing to recognize is that people are situated differently within our culture, within our history, within our land, and we have to make sure that we address that and accommodate that. Next slide. So we have moved from equality, give everyone the same thing, to equity, recognizing that people have different needs, to what we could call target universalism or equity 2.0 or belonging. I want to point out that the middle slide, the middle panel in this slide, suggests that the problem is with the people. So you fix the people. Some people are too short to look over the fence. It's not the people that's the problem. It's the problem is with the structure. And so the final slide shows even if people are the same in some important aspect, structures can sort people in unequal ways. Next slide. So, so we move from exclusion, inclusion to belonging. Next slide. I hate to say this, but you're being shown a PowerPoint that was a wrong PowerPoint. So I lost the PowerPoint I have, and somehow it's a good one, but it's just not for this conference. um,
Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
so I'm gonna pull up my PowerPoint on my phone so I can keep going because I know we have limited time. Sorry for the mishap. If I can find it here. I have it on my phone now if I can figure out. Okay. Let's go back to that slide and see if we can. Um, okay, so yes, this is the right one. All right, so this looks at segregation in the Bay Area, and we've developed a new way of looking at segregation. And one of the things that's important, again, segregation is not just separating people based on their race or ethnicity from each other. It's actually segregating opportunity. It's a distribution of opportunity. So we don't take Black people and just put them someplace separate. We put them away from grocery stores. We put them away from transportation lines. We put them close to toxic dumps. We put them close to noise pollution. So space is the way we actually organize opportunity. The old slide came up, and then I keep going back to this one. Can we go back to what was just on the screen? Apparently, we have two different slides coming up. Okay. All right. We also actually organize opportunity through zoning. And this is looking at zoning in California. So we use not just sort of the police with a gun, although we use them as well. We use space to actually distribute people, to actually block people. And zoning is one of the most important ways of doing that. What this next slide shows is that and I'll make these available, that when we zone for single family house exclusively, it tends to be a much more wider area. So we use zoning. So we don't think about this necessarily, but single family housing in the United States and in California under the present context is almost a guarantee that you have an overwhelmingly white area. So we have to think about how we use different mechanisms and structures to distribute opportunity in a racialized way. And this is looking at residential zoning in California. And so one of the things we've done—
John,
yes.
I'm sorry. I'm wondering if we might ask you to share your slides again. For some reason, the slides that our tech team has, the rest of us can't see. I know it was a little bit of a drag trying to get your slides up, but
Now I'm looking at my slides on my computer. Can you not see them now?
we cannot see them. So somebody needs to give, you need to scroll your arrow down to say show screen, as far as I understand.
I think I have to come out of this first, because when I scroll my arrow down now, I don't see anything. So let me come out of this.
And huge appreciation for all the audience and their patience. We are all learning this new crazy way of doing things. And if our tech team, if somebody might help walk John through getting his slides shared, I know our audience would totally appreciate seeing them. Fabulous. So I think, John, if you go to the fifth icon over that says set up slideshow, fifth from the left.
Yep. Slideshow.
It's this one that says set up slideshow.
Okay.
And then I think you have it on the right one. Okay.
Yeah.
Can people see it now?
We're seeing both sides, but I say let's go with it so that you can continue your presentation. This is much better than seeing nothing.
All right. So basically, what we've done at the Institute, and is excuse me?
We're back, and I guess, John, the one other point, if you go all the way to the left now, there's one that says play from current, second to from the left, play from current slide.
Let's see.
In the white bar, right? Over to the left, play from current slide, right there.
Okay. All right.
And then I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves again. In particular, the Housing California and tech team, some of you have not been muted. So if you could go on mute, it'll help us move through this.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see things now.
You look great. Your slides look great.
So I sometimes say to people, I don't know which I like least, traveling on planes all the time or doing Zoom. But anyway, but I definitely enjoy being present with all of you. So this is what we've done is do something called, this is actually looking at segregation. Let's go back. What we've done in California is actually look at how we use space to actually distribute opportunities. So what we do is opportunity mapping. We can actually map out the opportunity looking at as many as sometimes literally 100 different indicators. We usually use between 14 and 30 to sort of see where opportunity is distributed. And then we look at where we're placing affordable housing. And what we found in California and in much of the country, as you can see from this chart, is that most of the housing, the affordable housing, went in low resource areas. What this means is that it goes to areas where the schools are not working well, where there's no transportation, where there's high crime. And this is what we're doing today. This is not years ago, and this is the largest federal program in the country. The good news is how you place those dollars, how you spend those dollars is entirely up to the state. So we should be thinking about if we're going to build more low-income housing, and we need much more, we should build it where there's opportunity, where people can thrive. This is just another map sort of demonstrating that. So what are some of the tools to actually confront the housing crisis in California? There are a number of them. I just talked about building houses in high opportunity areas. That's actually extremely important, except the amount of housing is still too low. So even if we build housing through the low-income housing tax credit program, the amount of housing is low. The overall need, the overall gap in California for housing is somewhere over 3 million housing. That's a state. So we have this huge gap in terms of the need for housing. So we have to find some way of actually addressing that. So these are some of the things that they were doing in the Bay Area. Lessons from the Bay Area. Again, make sure that low-income housing tax credit are built in high opportunity areas. Rent control. This is another, and I want to emphasize this. Rent control is really important, but it's a stopgap measure. By itself, it doesn't actually address the underlying problem. I mentioned that there are over 3 million units short. Rent control doesn't address that problem. So while we need to have rent control as a stopgap measure, it is not a long-term solution by itself. Inclusionary zoning. Basically, inclusionary zoning is saying you're telling developers that when they build affordable market rate housing, they need to also include below market rate housing. This is actually a good strategy when the market is building a lot, because it's not requiring additional government resources. It's saying to the developer, you're building, you have to build you have to include affordable housing, below market rate housing. And the costs for the developers oftentimes offset by increasing density, by saying, okay, you can have extra units for building below market rate housing, so you capture your money back. There are mobility grants, which are giving grants, whether Section 8 or others, to communities and to people to say, you have a grant to actually live in a higher opportunity area. The cost of living in those areas in terms of housing oftentimes is prohibitive. So we use grants as one, again, stopgap measurement to actually address this. San Francisco adopted an inclusionary zoning program, and it did have a positive impact, but it also had a negative impact. So you're dealing with complex systems. So you have to look at not only what you're intending to do, what's the impact of that system. Housing trust funds, again, creating money and resources that's available for low-income housing. This is something that's being explored. an important measure, but too small. It can never get to that 3 million units that we need. Development Bank. Uh, Most people who do housing will probably know this, but I'll say it anyway. Housing is not simply a place we live in. Housing is a credit market. And so we actually have to understand the credit system and how do you actually make credit available to actually build housing. One reason housing is so attractive for creditors is that it's high leverage. Um, right now, it doesn't look that way, but generally, it's an important place to actually invest money because it's high leverage and is relatively safe. So we have to go upstream and think about how do we actually organize the credit market to make sure funds are available to build the kind of housing we want. In California, used to have uh, a bank to do this. It doesn't have that anymore. We need to re-explore that. So those are some of the scenarios. Let me just end by saying two things. One, I think it's really important not to just be process oriented, to not just look at what you're doing in terms of going in, but look at what's coming out. What's the impact? Are we really creating housing for the unhoused? Are we addressing the gap in terms of number of housing? Are we making sure that people live in um, uh, high opportunity areas? At the early slides, you may have seen there was one looking at um, the affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is actually an important concept. It was put together when Obama was in the White House. We worked on it. It says that HUD, and you can actually do it at a state level, has an affirmative obligation to address housing needs. That is, you're not saying let's move the impediments. We're not saying let's stop discriminating. We're saying we affirmatively structure systems to produce certain outcomes. That was put on hold by the Trump administration, but there's no reason that California can't do that itself. So the outcome oriented and organized structures and policies to achieve those outcomes. The last thing I'll mention is that housing is also a great place in terms of a tax break, even though uh, we shouldn't be given tax break to housing that's actually segregated, to communities that refuse to build affordable housing. We have to actually take away some of the local control or put some parameters around it. So you can build your own housing, but you have to build your fair share of affordable and low income housing in high opportunity areas. Sorry for all the technical problems. I'll make the PowerPoint available, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, Professor Powell. We're going to turn it right over to our next speaker, Amanda Andere.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yes?
We can hear you, Amanda.
Great. I'm saying good afternoon because I'm based out on the East Coast, but I know it's morning for all of you. So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me today. I am in awe and honored to follow Johnny Powell, who I know has been a mentor to many of us thinking about racial equity and racial justice, and who is always so kind. I've had the honor to just be in the audience with him or sit next to him in a dialogue. And when he talks about othering and belonging, he doesn't just talk about it. He walks the talk and how he treats people and how he creates an environment for people to be included. And I think that's so important in our housing and racial justice leaders, that they walk the talk in their work. So I just want to give a framework for how funders, those who hold resources, those who hold power, can be thinking about what is our journey together to move from racial equity to racial justice and housing justice. For those of you who don't know Funders Together to End Homelessness, we are a national network of more than 250 foundations, United Ways, corporate and other private giving programs. And we have, for the last almost 5 years, centered our work around racial equity. We are every day trying to become a more anti-racist organization and think about how we think about grant making through a racial justice lens. And I sometimes feel like an outsider from a national organization speaking to local and statewide groups, but I feel a special connection to the work in California as we have 3 funder networks in the state of California, in LA, in San Diego, and just launched one in the Bay Area. And last year, before the pandemic, we launched a network of funders committed to housing policy and policy to end homelessness. And all of our networks and funders working in the state of California, I know, are committed to racial equity and racial justice in their own way and in their own work. So I want to talk today about our journey towards that. Last year, Funders Together to End Homelessness released our commitment to racial equity, which stated that the work to end homelessness must center equity to strengthen existing strategies and solutions and create new approaches that more effectively recognize and meet the needs of people of color experiencing homelessness. I think that has been so clear in this pandemic and the health pandemic we're facing, and in the awakening, the long overdue awakening and the uprising that's created a new type of awareness to the racial pandemic that we have long been facing. We know that COVID is not the great equalizer. In fact, we understand uniquely, as Race Forward reminds us, that COVID-19 kills and racism is its accomplice. So how do we sit with all that in our work? How do we start to look inward individually and as organizations and as communities and those who hold resources to act on some of the stuff that Dr. Powell was talking about in a way that is actually meaningful, that acknowledges our racialized history, centers people with lived expertise, especially people of color with lived expertise, and not just twinkling around the edges of our work, but fundamentally uprooting our oppressive and suppressive systems. So we have been using a framework since the beginning of the pandemic, offered by my colleague, Unique Redwood, who's the CEO of the Consumer Health Foundation based in DC. I want to offer some of those questions for you to be thinking about in the midst of this crisis and in our long-term recovery. How does your response, even in the midst of crisis, contribute to long-term systems change? How are the voices of impacted communities centered? What data, quantitative or qualitative, are driving resource allocation? And what does that data tell you about the experiences of various racial ethnic groups? How are women and LGBTQIA people of color particularly impacted? And what are possible unintended consequences of these decisions you might make? What additional disaggregated demographic data will you collect, track, and evaluate to assess equity impacts of COVID and now this housing crisis that we're experiencing moving forward? And how will that data inform your future decisions when the crisis is over? Most importantly, how are the actions you are taking grounded in the racialized history of our country? And I'll drop those questions in the chat after I'm done. For too long, our systems and nonprofits have rested their hopes in an equality frame. Now we are waking up to realize we cannot give everyone the same thing and expect the same results. Because the system is not broken. It was designed by white supremacist slave owners on stolen indigenous land to protect their interests. It is working just as it was designed. And just like Eric Garner and George Floyd, Black and indigenous people and people of color have been unable to fully breathe because the system is working and has been functioning as intended for 400 plus years. So the 2 questions I want to ask you as you go on your learning journey during this Housing California unconference is, how are you going to uproot those systems of oppression? How are we going to undo the work and the way that we've been doing this work not to be rooted in oppressive systems? Is it enough to settle our hopes in racial equity? Or do the times demand for racial and housing justice? As gatekeepers, do we need to act as allies? Or is it time for us to be co-conspirators for justice? So the first question is racial equity enough? Or must we think about racial equity as a path to racial justice, and for our work, housing justice? I define housing justice as agency and power over where people live. Housing justice for me is rooted in repair and reparations of government-sanctioned racism that allows folks in communities to design their own communities and define what safety means for them. Our partners at the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, PRE, and their latest resource urging us as gatekeepers to move from racial equity to racial justice, define racial justice as this: a racial equity lens separates systems from causes, but a racial justice lens brings into view the confrontation of power and the redistribution of resources and the systematic transformation necessary for real change. Justice requires urgent fundamental changes that reposition communities of color in relation to power and resources, which includes being able to challenge and shape many institutions that determines a community's condition. I want to take a step back. I realize I've been talking about this idea of gatekeepers and power, and I want us to just frame, what does that mean? How are we gatekeepers? I think it's important to reckon with the fact that we are all gatekeepers of power and resources in our community. That communities, not leaders, not me as a CEO of a nonprofit, not public policy makers, not elected officials, not the CEO of Housing California, need to have agency and power over their own resources, especially housing. But too many times in our system, philanthropy are gatekeepers to money, and in turn, nonprofits and government become gatekeepers to that same money through our program implementation and resource allocation. And especially in housing policy and advocacy, we are gatekeepers to access to decision makers and policy makers. We're even gatekeepers to how we decide on our priorities for policy. And oftentimes our tables are created, bringing people with lived expertise and lived experience to the table with not a permanent chair, but with a folding chair. And so I often wonder, as gatekeepers to power and resources, how do we get rid of the idea of needing a table at all? How do we start making decisions that are rooted in community? How do we share and give up power in a way that is community led? And how do we do that inside structures, outside of structures, and understand that we can do both at the same time if our ultimate goal is to set us up to uproot those structures in ways that demand a justice framework, and ways that demand that community leads us and that we not lead community. This is really hard to do. When we're talking about liberating and decolonizing our role as gatekeepers, recognizes that I and others might not have power anymore, that our voices might not matter, that our voices will look different, that we will change the way that we work through transformation and the process of transformation and giving up power. And I gotta admit, that feels really uncomfortable. I know it feels uncomfortable to me sometimes. It feels probably uncomfortable to those who take comfort in their position and in their power. It also feels uncomfortable because we've set up a system designed to take in resources, redistribute based off of policies and practices, and never examine what those policies and practices are rooted in, where they come from, how they actually harm communities, and that they don't actually help in trusting communities to be agencies over their own resources. And breaking down and tearing down that system means uprooting how we think about everything. But I think this unconference is the perfect time to do that. It's the perfect time to uproot our thinking as we sit in the comfort of our own homes or maybe in our offices. It's the perfect time to recognize that what we've been doing has not been working because we are still tinkering around the edges and we have not firmly rooted ourselves in housing justice. I want to close with my second question about, is it enough for us to be allies, or do we need to work to be co-conspirators? So what does it mean to be a co-conspirator today? Anyway, and if I'm already an ally, why do I need to transition to co-conspirator? I like to use this definition that's found by a woman whose last name is Rush, and she talks about this idea of co-conspirator in the reproductive justice movement, but I think it applies to our housing justice movement. To put it simply, being an ally is lazy. While yes, it is great that white people are willing to give their support to people of color, and for us as gatekeepers, that people with power are willing to give support and seemingly fund and support people with lived expertise or people in community, we need to do more. This is where the term co-conspirator comes to play. By definition, a co-conspirator who is engaged in conspiracy with another or others. To be a white co-conspirator or a co-conspirator as a gatekeeper means to deliberately acknowledge that Black and Indigenous people and people of color every day are criminalized for dismantling white supremacy. It means we choose to take on the consequences of participating in a criminalized act with them. And we choose to center Black and Indigenous people and people of color and people with lived experience in the movement for housing justice. It means that we do that by uprooting all of our thinking, by not sitting on the sidelines. And when we do sit on the sidelines, engage in acts that put something on the line that we know Black and Indigenous and people of color are putting on the line every day. I hope with those questions and that framework, we can not only engage in discussion today, but it will help you engage in new thinking as you attend this unconference. Thank you.
So if we were all in the big ballroom where we originally thought we were going to be having this conference, y'all would be reaching out for your second cup of coffee, probably. So I encourage you to make yourself comfortable. We're going to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes having a conversation. So if I can get videos back on for John and Elizabeth as well. We are going to hear a bit more from each of our speakers. I think I'm going to turn to John first. You've noted, and we talked about this a bit as we were prepping, that conversations around reconciliation and healing often focus on individual and interpersonal work. This is necessary, but clearly insufficient. In order for us to really move to the structural transformation we've been talking about today, a whole host of other things need to come into play. Can you talk a bit with us about how you think about using the past to understand and reimagine a just future? What does that look like for you? How do you do that?
Well, thank you. Great question. And I must say, Amanda, I really enjoyed listening to you and learning from you. So thank you. So, I mean, in a sense, the past is actually reflected in how we do housing, how we organize space. But it's also contested in terms of what kind of future we're going to have. So I lived in San Francisco when I first came out to the Bay Area. And then teaching at Berkeley with traffic, I eventually decided to move over to Berkeley. My son was not very happy. And he was saying, Black people are being pushed out of San Francisco. The number of Black people who live in San Francisco now could all fit within the stadium. San Francisco used to have the largest percentage of Black people in the city of any city west of the Mississippi. It's now under 4%. Oakland as a Black city. Literally, tens of thousands of people are being pushed out of Oakland every day. And they land in places where they're not welcome, where they're not resources. And you have this process churning all over again. And also, if you think about the pandemic, um, as COVID sort of ravaged the country, even our way of actually addressing it was rooted in uh, either myopic or actual racism. So we said, wash your hands frequently. Uh, in Detroit, where I'm from, they have water shut off. In Arizona and Utah, the indigenous people, Navajo in particular, people called Navajo, uh, not only live far apart, but don't, between 30 and 40%, don't have access to water, running water. So even the intervention was actually, in a sense, reflecting the normalcy of the white experience in the United States. And you go to the Central California, where you have people working, farm workers who live in dorms, and they say shelter in place, but stay away from each other. Or you look at people who are unhoused, and they say, don't leave your house. Like I don't have a house not to leave. I mean, it just goes on and on. So the history is actually sketched in our structures and in our understanding and in our geography. And to your point, I think when we think about anti-racism or racism in the United States, we almost entirely focus on interpersonal. Uh, and, the, interpersonal doesn't explain why there's not water uh, on the Navajo reservation. Interpersonal doesn't explain why there's not credit in certain communities. My friend and your former boss, maybe, Angela Blackwell, often says, who decides, who pays, and who benefits? And what Amanda just talked about is that decision makers oftentimes are not from the community. And so if you think about boards, and there's a bill now coming up through California which says that all boards must have underrepresented people of color on them, all public boards. That seems radical, but they've been doing that in Europe for decades. Uh, and so who decides? And again, historically, we're locked out of decisions about our own lives. And I love the idea of moving just from uh, um, equity to justice. And I would say even one more step is belonging. And belonging contemplates agency, it contemplates power, it contemplates caring and responsibility. But the power part is not just power between people, but power in terms of structures and institutions. And the last thing I'll say is, again, it's not just removing the impediments. It's like, how do we structure those institutions and systems to produce the outcome we want? That's what we have to do. And we have to be particularly focused on people who are historically uh, um, cut out and brutalized by those systems.
Thank you so much, John. Amanda, I'm going to go to you next. You recently co-wrote and published an article with Bill Pitkin in the Chronicles of Philanthropy entitled "Philanthropy Won't Make Headway on Racial Justice Without Tackling Housing Justice," where you noted that philanthropy has really stepped in during this moment and leaned in to address racial justice. Will you please share a few of your reflections around philanthropy, what you explored in that article, and really give us some ideas about how the rest of us make a difference? How do we step into this work in the way that you're asking in that powerful piece?
Thank you. I think when Bill Pitkin and I were thinking about this idea of there's no racial justice with housing justice, we wanted to acknowledge the incredible transformation that is happening in philanthropy that is funding and supporting racial justice in new ways and saying Black Lives Matter in ways that actually matter. But what's often missing, but is underlined the surface in a lot of the community and organizing groups that are working around racial justice, And I noted this Friday night when I watched the Black National Convention. Every single panel talked about housing, talked about land use, talked about occupation of land and occupation of housing. The movement for Black lives, the movement for racial justice recognizes that housing is critical to that. But overall, I don't know that philanthropy has started to think about housing as a tool for racial justice. And so, we wanted to lift up some of the stuff that I talked about in my remarks. And that is the idea of building the power of grassroots networks and philanthropy getting uncomfortable with being comfortable in funding movements and organizing. We have to realize that for housing, the who sees the people who are impacted by housing insecurity first are not big systems. It's not the COC, it's not a big agency, it's the communities and the organizers on the ground. It's the aunt at the end of the street. It's these collective models that we are starting to hear more about. And that's actually what philanthropy needs to be investing in first if we want to think about even preventing people into falling into housing insecurity and homelessness. And those organizations and entities are not C3s. The revolution will not happen in our C3 nonprofit status, and philanthropy needs to get uncomfortable and figure out ways to fund those. When we listen to those communities, we actually start to inform our traditional advocacy and policy. And that's where our policy priorities need to come from, not the other way around. And we haven't done a great job of actually funding ways that folks can have those uncomfortable, really tense dialogues about what we should be hearing from the streets that should inform our grass tops housing advocacy and policy. And we also have to reckon with what we know is changing the narrative around housing, and recognize that that narrative doesn't just come from the left or right. It's actually within the water we swim in terms of how we think about housing insecurity and homelessness as a people problem rather than a systems failure. And philanthropy has a role in thinking about funding public will and political will. So we don't just tinker around the edges. So we actually get to investing in the things that we know can end homelessness and housing insecurity. And those are the things that we talked about in that piece that's really funding in a different way, funding radically, actually, and that all folks who care about racial justice should be thinking about housing justice.
Elizabeth, I'm going to come to you next. As we were preparing for this plenary, the three of us, John, Amanda, and Elizabeth, got to spend a bit of time talking about power, and that theme has certainly come up in our conversation today, the power to show up and create change, the power to actually build movements. We talked about how critical that is. We know that embedding change in institutions and structures is our path to doing this. But we also know that there's huge money and power standing in front of us. And that as soon as we start to feel like we're making progress, we run into this very recalcitrant and entrenched power. Where do you see opportunities, Elizabeth, to build movement power? Where are you seeing success? What other learnings are you observing in the work to build power? I know you work with a broad set of tribes in the housing space and in the tribal sovereignty space more broadly. How do you see this coming up in your work? And what do you see for the rest of us in this work to build power?
First of all, the biggest obstacle in tribal communities is that we don't have equitable funding opportunities. So in California, we have 109 federally recognized tribes, which are each individual sovereign governments. With this, it takes advocacy. And, you know, touching on what Amanda said is that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I see the ability to build movement power in being that co-conspirator. If I'm truly working towards housing justice and housing equity, I'm going to empower the tribes that I serve to where I'll work myself out of a job. If we're truly talking about equity, that means that we're enriching those communities to stand on their own. The successes that I'm seeing are in the opportunity now that we have for state funding. One of our tribes here is the first tribal community to be able to get a home grant. And so there's a lot of changes coming, but there's still a lot of work to do. And with the state of the pandemic and with things that are happening, you know, people want to focus on the Navajo Nation without realizing that those inequities live here in tribal communities. We're so quick to fix things outside of our backyard that we don't measure that those inequities are right in front of us. There's a lot of opportunities I see in collaborations with communities of color, of low-income tax credit builds between tribal communities and other minority communities. And that takes relationship building. And, you know, the change comes at the speed of trust. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of advancement that needs to happen in policies. I sit on a board, and one of the biggest biases I see is that we only want to fund nonprofits. We don't think about funding community-based organizations. And being a woman of color, I think that it's very true that we can't just build for communities. There should be nothing for us without us. And so seeing more organizations include communities or have the movement for housing be community driven with an understanding is the way that I see us building power. Thank you so much, Tian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So before we close out, I want to do a quick power round with each of our speakers. Hopefully we can get everyone's videos up at the same time. I want one parting thought from each of you. And this is really, I want to hear your reflection on how do we move from this transactional work that eats up so much of our time and that we're all kind of churning around every day. How do we move from transactional work to transformative change? One reflection, one quick reflection before we close out in 2 minutes. And Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you.
I would say community collaboration.
How about you, Amanda?
I would say that we move from a frame of anti-racist to being pro-Black and pro-Indigenous in our housing work. And we not just think about what we can be against, but what we can be for.
John, last but certainly not least.
I would say that as we think about power and imagining a new world, we think about it broadly, not just in terms of our community, but that we're in relationship with each other, so that I don't want to just be making decisions for the community I live in. I want to be making decisions for the state, for the city, for the world, all the people in it.
Thank you all. I want to express huge gratitude to each of you, to our interpreters, to our tech team, and to all our participants. I think this is the first time I've had the opportunity to attend a statewide housing conference of this sort with an all of color opening panel. So thank you to the Housing California team for making that possible. It's been a pleasure to speak with all of you, and I hope all of our guests enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a wonderful day.
Here, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.